Judy and Marilyn. Good evening, church. Good evening. Very subdued tonight. Good evening. I feel like I'm in a library. How are you doing tonight? Good. All right, it's good to see you tonight. Glad you're here. We're still looking at this group called the Methodists. They're now called the United Methodist Church. Next time we get together, we'll look at which is a new church that actually began in 1968, the United Methodist Church. Right now we're looking at their forebears and some of the history to find out how they got where they are today. And they're in an interesting place. The last couple of sessions as we look at the modern United Methodist Church will be quite interesting. But right now we're looking at Methodists in America. We've gone back to the Revolutionary War in the 1800s. Our text for this part of the series is 1 Peter 2:9. If you want to open your New Testament, let's look at that verse together. There's a very, very important idea, New Testament idea, in this text that we're going to use to differentiate ourselves, Baptists, from Methodists. One of the things that really distinguishes the two groups. Throughout history, there have been a lot of things, the last couple 300 years anyway, there have been a lot of things that we've had in common. But there are some very distinct things that we don't hold in common. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9, of course, Peter, the apostle, is writing to the church, and he says, "But you all are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for a special possession, so that the excellent things you might proclaim of the one who called you from darkness into his glorious light." Two words there, the royal priesthood. We get from that a theology that we call the priesthood of believers. And there are ideas involved in this that will begin to distinguish us from the Methodist Church. But on your outline, quick review, we'll catch up to where we are and finish this outline tonight, God willing. Number one, we've already learned that during the American Revolution, American Methodists were seen as traitors because of Wesley's, that's John Wesley's, loyalty to England. Remember, Methodists trace their beginnings back to brothers, actually, John and Charles Wesley. But John was the theologian and the organizer, and they were English. And they were staunchly English. They were loyal to the king. And so during the American Revolutionary War, Methodists here in the United States were looked at with great suspicion. They were considered to be loyal to the king, and so they were thought to be disloyal to the American Revolution. As a result of that, many of the Methodist preachers assigned by John Wesley were recalled. In fact, all of them were recalled to England. But there was one fellow who stayed, and he had a lot to do with the course of Methodism in the United States. Number two, after the colonies fought for independence, the 13 colonies that became the United States of America, from England, American Methodists asserted independence from John Wesley. So as we as a nation asserted our independence from England, Methodists decided that the time was right for them to become independent from the movement that had started in the 1700s in England. And so they distanced themselves from John Wesley and eventually took over the Methodist Church and built an American Methodist Church, which was very distinct from the Methodist Church in England from the very beginning because of just our hard-headed, individualistic ideas about democracy in the United States. And those were the kind of people who made up the Methodist Church as well. Now, at this time, right after the Revolutionary War, let's get back into sort of the flavor of where the church was. If you haven't studied history, you may not be aware of the fact that the Christian church in the United States of America, right after the American Revolution, was in a very bad slump, in a very bad place. By some counts, 5 or 6% of the people in the newly formed United States of America attended church. 5 or 6%. Some say as much as 10% were attending church after the American Revolution. That's really quite stunning. When you figure that today, for many years, some 40% at least attend church at least once a month or so. And so there was a low ebb in the church. There were a lot of reasons for that. For one thing, a lot of the buildings had been destroyed during the Revolutionary War. Some people say that the French influence, with its deism and more liberal ideas, had something to do with that. And one major thing was that there was something new, a new idea that we forged in the fires of our country, which was this separation of church and state. Something that we take for granted today, but it was brand new back then, because most of the churches in Europe expected some sort of support from the government to exist. Established churches, the Anglican Church in England, the Roman Catholic Church in the rest of Europe, and Protestant churches in other places. Europe had been torn into Catholicism and Protestantism, but everywhere you went, there was a state church, and if you lived there, you paid taxes to support that church and to support the clergy of that church. When we came here, we said, no more of that. We're not going to have that anymore. No more established churches. And so the church had to figure out a new way to do church. We had to go out and do what it is that we do now that we're just used to. You go out and you convert people to Christ. You bring them in and convince them that you're doing a good work, and you all support that work, but you don't expect money from the government to pay your preacher or to build your building or maintain your building or any of those things. So all of that was churning in the works, and it all kind of worked against the church at first, but the church recovered quite nicely and did very well, and God had His hand in it. Because at the beginning of the 1800s, there was something called the Second Great Awakening, and it really fired people up in the United States of America. It was a new country, and there was a new revival fire. There was a First Great Awakening in the 1700s before we became an independent nation, and starting in the early 1800s, there was a second one that influenced our country for decades. And some people would say up until the present day, and I would agree with them, but certainly for decades there was a strong move of revivalism, people being saved. And so on your outline, we've already filled that in, and that catches us up in the newly established United States of America, the Methodist Episcopal Church, and that's what the Methodists were called at first. The Episcopal Church in the United States is the equivalent of not the equivalent, but it's the American version of the Anglican Church in England. And so they took that name on because it was a vestige of who they were in England. In England, they were connected to the Anglican Church. They came here, they were a society, they were set up to be supportive of an established church. Well, they came here, there's no established church. They tried to have the same relationship with the Episcopal Church, but the Episcopal Church didn't want to have anything to do with them, so all they had was just in their name, Methodist Episcopal Church. But they were on their own to forge a new church, an independent church, something that John Wesley hadn't done and frankly didn't want to do. And so they were in new waters as well, trying to figure out organizationally how to build a church that was not connected to an established church. They benefited from three things. We've already filled the first one out. They benefited from this great awakening. Let me just say that if you have any inclination at all to read history, and I know some of you are like, history? Why would you read that? You'd have to tie me to a chair and beat me to make me do that. Well, if you're in high school, you do, but as you grow up and you get more interested in these things, they become more fascinating to read about. And one of the things that is really interesting to read about from our heritage, both as Americans and as Christians, are these great awakenings. If you've never read about them, you ought to do that. It's inspiring because it's a reminder of what God can do when He gets hold of a country. You see, He has gotten hold of our country before. Before we were independent, and right after we were independent from England. We need to remember that. We need to carry that memory with us so that we know what's possible for God to do in our country today. We should never give up. We should never give up because things were pretty dark spiritually in this country right after the Revolution. And God turned it around in a way that is almost beyond belief. It's astounding. That's why I say you should read about it if you're not aware of it. It's very encouraging reading. Okay, now another factor that assisted the Methodist Church after the Revolutionary War is this mass migration of people. People began to move west from the east. They began to move west from the old world, from France and England and Spain and Italy. They began to come across the Atlantic into the United States, and as they came into the eastern seaboard, the population was just pushed westwards in the United States. And so the church found itself with this incredibly transient population. People were just moving everywhere. And so, it was disorienting for the church, because the church was used to the old world in England and France and other places where people were born, lived, and died their entire life, probably in one little community. Rarely would they move. And suddenly, we're here in the United States, this dynamic new country with all kinds of life and potential in it, and people were on the move. One of the greatest mass migrations in all of history was during the 1800s, when our forefathers began to move off the eastern seaboard, cross the Mississippi River, and settle the land that we now call the United States of America. All these states that were settled, the wilderness that they moved into. And so the church had to figure out a way to exist in the midst of all of this. Some did rather well, others didn't do so well. Presbyterians and others who were more established and their history was more connected to Europe, they didn't do as well. They were churches that appealed more to the wealthy leaders in the community. And those people were less likely to move because they'd already made it big. People that moved were the people that weren't doing so well. They wanted a better chance in life. They were the lower classes. The people who would say, look around and say, all the farmland's used up around here. I can't do anything. And I'm hearing these reports of people out in Ohio and on the other side of the Mississippi. I'm hearing these reports of people that are going out there and they have all this acreage and they can build a new life for themselves. And so they would take their family and put it into a covered wagon with everything that they owned, and they would move west. And there were a couple of churches that went with them as they moved west, and both of these groups did rather well with these rough-hewn, individualistic types of people. You want to guess which two churches it was?
Methodist and Baptist.
The Methodists and the Baptists, absolutely. The Methodists and the Baptists. We were both out there on the forefront, and the Methodists actually, at this part of history, did a little bit better than we did. And the reason for that is because of the way Methodism was set up. They had these circuit rider preachers, okay? The bishop would assign these preachers who would ride circuits, all these different towns, all these different settlements. And so they were already mobile. Baptists tended to be farmers. And they wanted to work the land and build a home, build a spread, so they would get into one place and stop, and they would minister to people in that community. So they weren't quite as mobile. They didn't move as quickly with the population as the population moved west. The Methodists, however, with this circuit riding, they were quicker at being able to move with that mobile population as it moved west. So the Methodists flourished because of their organization as they went westward. Now, I don't want to say it's only organization. We don't want to take anything away from what the Lord was doing. They were preaching the gospel, just like Baptists were. Now, remember, there's one probably for us very distinct, one thing that's very different between their approach to the gospel, even back then when they were more evangelistic and evangelical. There was one thing that we would tend to disagree with them on in preaching the gospel. Who has picked up on that as we've gone along? What was a big difference between Baptists and Methodists back in the 1800s in their preaching and their teaching of the Bible? That was one of them right there, was infant baptism. They still have this idea of the established church. Remember, in the established church, when you have a state church, the state wants everybody to be part of that church because it's trying to keep everyone together. And one way to do that is to baptize everyone just as soon as they're born. And as they grow up, you just tell them, oh, well, you're already a member of the church. Oh, well, you're already, what do you mean you need to be saved? We don't do that around here. Literally. That's what you're told. We don't do that. You've already been baptized. You're part of the church. You don't need to do anything else. And so you just grow up being taught and believing that everything is okay with you, and you're part of the establishment. Those crazy Baptists, though, what did they believe? Every single individual has to decide for themselves. Soul freedom. Every soul is free to decide to either reject or accept Christ. Now, the establishment folks thought we were nuts because we were going to break up society. Well, you're going to destroy everything that we've built. There's going to be a bunch of people running around who are going to reject Christ, and they won't be part of the establishment. Well, the church was never meant to be the establishment in the first place, we would say. And so anyway, this westward expansion. The other thing, though, that I want you to remember is that Methodists believed that you could lose your what?
Salvation.
Lose your salvation. The Baptists tended to be a little bit more predestinarian, a little bit more toward the Calvinistic side, although every group had its different eddies and running in it theologically. So there were some distinctives. So this westward expansion, do we write that down? Number 2 on number 3, if that makes any sense? In the newly established USA, the Methodist Episcopal Church benefited from participation in westward expansion. Westward expansion. They did a great job. They were just set up without even realizing it to do well with westward expansion. The third thing that I've seen in why the Methodists did so well in the 1800s is a man. His name is Francis Asbury. I've already talked to you about him. He's the one who came over, and when Wesley said, everybody come back, he said, no, I like these folks, I like this place, I'm staying. And he stayed through the Revolutionary War, and then he became a leader in Methodism in the early 1800s after the Revolutionary War was over. He lived from 1745 to 1816. He was born in Birmingham, England, not Alabama, Birmingham, England. His parents were early followers of John Wesley, so he was raised in this environment of Wesleyanism. Converted at the age of 13, he began preaching, and when John Wesley asked for volunteers to come to the United States, or to the colonies at that point, in 1771, he came. And he used that same organization that they were using in England, local groups, societies, with circuit rider preachers that would go from society to society and teach and preach to them, and conferences that were in charge of the groups and in charge of the preachers. Now, Asbury was in charge of the Methodist Church at a time where they had to make a decision, because more and more people in the Methodist Church were looking around what was going on in the United States, and they wanted to do things the way they were done here. And one of those was a settled clergy. You get a preacher for a group and you leave them there. And he didn't like that. He liked the Wesleyan model where you move the preachers around, where they're constantly on the move. That's the way he was. He was always on the move. He told his preachers, he said, go into every kitchen and shop, address all, aged and young, on the salvation of their souls. His idea was really that preachers sounded more like evangelists, in a sense, than pastors. And he set the example. Before he died, now remember, this is the late 1700s and the early 1800s. The man was riding a horse and walking, okay? He traveled 300,000 miles. 300,000 miles. And that was no small task in the type of traveling that he was involved in, mostly on horseback. He went into Canada several times. He crossed the Appalachians 60 times. 60 times to reach previously unreached Americans. He knew the American countryside better than any other person in his generation. Yeah, isn't that interesting? Here's a guy that had done such extensive traveling in the United States in the early years that he knew the people and the places so well that he should probably be included in what? something that high school students use to learn about our country. History books. Yeah. Why would he not be included in the history books?
She's a religious person.
Are any high school students in here learn about Francis Asbury when you looked at early United States history? There's so much about the history of our country that has been stripped out of the training that our children and young people get in school. Why? Because it's Christian. Because it's Christian. But they're getting a twisted view of our country. They're not hearing the whole story. And the biggest thing that I've talked about tonight is the Second Great Awakening. There is no way that you can study the history of the United States and come to any proper conclusions and understand who we are as people without knowing what happened during the Second Great Awakening. Nevertheless, every single student now goes in public schools and they learn about the United States and they never learn about what? They're not going to learn about the Second Great Awakening because it was a Christian revival and that is all separated out because we have these twisted views and separation of church and state. Even in our day, that's exactly right. And one of the things I've done, Kevin, is I've gone around and I love used bookstores and I love to look at used books as long as I can until Karen and Andy say, "Can we go now?" And one of the things I like to do is go into the history section and look for old textbooks. And I have found over the years old history textbooks that were used in high schools back in the 50s. And they don't have that in there, but they do have more about Christianity. You can see how Christianity was slowly purged from the high school textbooks through the 60s and 70s. So that by the time Kevin and I were in high school, it was pretty well gone. Can you really understand any people without knowing what they believe? That's foolishness. Nevertheless, you go read about it. If you weren't taught about it in high school, you go on the internet and Google it, you look up books on Amazon, whatever it takes, and find out what really happened at the beginning of our country. But here's a man who had a lot of passion. He was a Methodist. Here's something that he wrote. This is out of his journals. Remember, Wesley was a journal writing guy, and a lot of his followers were Asbury was. That's how we know how many miles that he traveled and how many times he crossed over the Appalachians, a lot of the other things. Here's an example of what he wrote. Quote, "The water froze as it ran from the horse's nostrils. I have suffered a little by lodging in open houses this cold weather, but this is a very small thing when compared to what the dear Redeemer suffered for the salvation of precious souls." Was he a passionate man? Here's a guy out there riding a horse that was so cold that the water coming out of the horse's nose is freezing. And all he can think of is the Lord Jesus Christ. And people need to hear the message of redemption. Now, somebody like that can drive a movement. And he did. He made a difference. He taught the same Christian message, whether it was in the wilderness or in the city, with the Wesleyan twist on it. Let's remember the things that we have in common and the things that we don't have in common, because there are things on both of those lists. He believed in God's free grace, and we do too. That's at the heart and soul of our message, that God offers salvation freely by grace. And Asbury believed in that. He believed in humanity's liberty to accept or reject that offer of free grace. Now, as far as that goes, we're still with him. We're okay with that. We're not the Calvinist type who say, well, God set all this up before he ever spoke into existence. Anything at all, he knew who was going to be saved and who was not going to be saved, and there's nothing we can do about it. We don't tend to believe that. Now, there are some Calvinistic Baptists, but as a group, we still believe that people can accept or reject the gospel. And so we go out and preach the gospel, and we give people the opportunity, sole freedom, to accept or reject the gospel. Now, he also believed in the Christian's need to strive for perfection. This is where we begin to have a little bit of a problem. And we've talked about this in here. Methodism, especially the old-style Methodism that John Wesley started, was after Christian perfection. And John struggled with this. We've already talked about it, how to define it and how to teach it. But he always had this fascination with the idea that a Christian could become completely sanctified in this life. You could actually reach a point of sinless perfection in this life. And that's where we as Baptists would say, well, no, we can't do that. Can't go there. We can become more and should become more mature spiritually as we follow the Lord Jesus Christ. But we do not fool ourselves into thinking that we will ever reach sinless perfection in this life. In fact, if we believe that, we're going to set ourselves up for a lot of frustration and probably damage our walk more than we would help it. We want to be realistic. We're after maturity, not perfection. We want to be more like Jesus. We don't believe we'll ever be exactly like Jesus, not in this life. But that Methodist piety, even though it had some wrong ideas about complete sanctification, about Christian perfection, it was intense. It was intense, and it had something to do with who we are as a people, as Methodism went west with the people. So here's the last thing, number three on number three. In the newly established United States of America, the Methodist Episcopal Church benefited from the strong leadership of whom? Francis Asbury. Francis Asbury. That's why you see a lot of Asbury Methodist churches, in case you ever wondered about that. Now, when Asbury came to America in 1771, there were 300, okay, 300 people part of the Methodist movement in the United States, in the colonies. 1771, 300 people. When he died in 1816, there were 200,000 Methodists with 2,000 itinerant preachers. So during his lifetime, and he didn't do it by himself, I don't get me wrong, any history lesson is somewhat simplified, but he was one of the movers and shakers. During his time in the United States, from the time he came here until he died, Methodists went from 300 to 200,000. So that was pretty rapid growth, and they continued to grow very rapidly. And during the Second Great Awakening, they, like a lot of others, like Baptists, Presbyterians, and others, created a lot of societies, tract societies, Bible societies, missionary societies, Sunday school unions, theological schools, all this apparatus that you and I take for granted today, these seminaries that we have, and these societies, tract societies, Bible societies, missionary groups, they were all children of the Second Great Awakening. They were born during the early 1800s. That's part of that movement, and one of the things that came out of it. So, number 4 on your outline, we'll fill that in real quickly. Methodists very quickly established one of the largest Christian denominations in America. Largest Christian denominations in America. Now, for the rest of the 1800s, without getting into a lot of detail, the Methodists hit a lot of ups and downs like Baptists did and all other Christians in the United States. Just to name one of the biggest, those of you who know anything at all about the history of the United States, after the 1800s got going, before 1900, what was one really big thing that happened in our country that affected everyone? The Civil War. The Civil War. What'd you say, Kevin?
I said immigration.
Well, that's on the list. Kevin said immigration, but that does come kind of right after the Civil War. The Civil War, it's hard for those of us who do not live through it. I know some of you are history buffs and you've read about it and studied it and you like to go out and look at the places where the soldiers fell and so forth. It's a defining moment in many ways in our country. And it changed a lot of institutions. It changed our country. And we don't have time to talk about it other than just to mention that Baptists were changed by it and Methodists were changed by it. Presbyterians, everybody was changed by it. Methodists, like Baptists, were ripped into two groups. Northern Methodists, Southern Methodists. Just like Baptists were ripped into two groups. Northern Baptists, Southern Baptists. Presbyterians, everybody. The whole country was ripped in half. And Methodists were hurt by this. Methodists were slow to assimilate the black population into their churches and to allow them to be a part of it. Methodists and Presbyterians both were slow. Baptists, we didn't always do the right thing either, but in many ways we were faster at assimilating blacks, or at least allowing them to have Baptist churches. In the Methodist group, some groups were spawned that you may have wondered about. One, the CME Church. Have you ever seen a ME Church. They came into existence in 1872 as a direct result of the aftermath of the Civil War. And what does that stand for? Does anybody know? CME? Colored Methodist Episcopal Church. Methodist Episcopal, but colored Methodist Church. A lot of other groups like that began to form. Now the Methodists were like the Baptists. One thing you have to admit is when Catholicism lost a grip on Christendom in the West, Christianity became very divisive. You know, we began to divide at that point, and we've divided ever since. It doesn't matter what group you pick, even Baptists. You know, we can divide over whether you wash a person's left foot first or their right foot first. You know, we got the left foot Baptist church on this side of town and the right foot Baptist church over on that side of town. There's just something about, once we decided that we could create new groups, it's like, well, this is great. You know, I can create a group that believes exactly like I do. And if you don't agree with me, then we'll fight it out in a business meeting, and we'll have a new church again. And we've been doing that for hundreds of years. And the Methodists were no different. They fractured and created a lot of new groups throughout the 1800s and the 1900s. And immigration, as Kevin mentioned, had a lot to do with that. The new urban frontier, as people began to gather into cities, that had a lot to do with the way churches were developing. But Methodism still had this paradox to it. It was a religion of the people, but at the same time, it was very autocratic. It had a very strong leadership that wanted to be in charge of everything. It was sort of schizophrenic in some ways. Yes, sir?
Is CME, what about the AME, the African American Methodist?
That was one of those groups that was formed. There's a bunch of them. There's a long list. And if you want to study that, come and see me after this is over, and I'll give you enough stuff to put you to sleep tonight without any trouble. Yeah, those are just all those churches. They just began to, and not only did Christian churches begin to spawn in the United States in the 1800s, freedom of religion also spawned what else? Cults. That's exactly right. We've studied some of them in here. What's a famous cult that grew up with this newfound religious freedom in the 1800s?
Mormons.
That's exactly right. The Mormons, and then there were the Christian Scientists and others. So our experiment has had good and bad to it. It has created some interesting side effects, but that's another story. Back to the Methodists. The Methodists, many times like John, they wanted to keep control from the top down. But these hard-headed Americans began to have a problem. Even people in England began to have a problem with that. After a while. Remember, John wanted to have the deeds on all the property. He wanted to have the right to assign the preachers and where they went and when they went. He wanted total control. And some of that came with Methodism into the United States. But it began to find people who revolted against that. Even as early as the 1700s, a man named O'Kelly decided that if they weren't going to give the local... Now listen carefully to this, because this is where we begin to come in. If they weren't going to begin to give the local congregations more control over their property and over their preachers, then they didn't want to have anything to do with Methodism anymore. And O'Kelly led a group that split off from the Methodists in the 1700s, and they called themselves, surprisingly, the Republican Methodists. The Republican Methodists. Now, that would be an oxymoron today, we'll find when we look at the modern Methodists. But back in the 1700s, there was a group called the Republican Methodists. And the Methodist Church has struggled with this over the years. How do you let local congregations have some sense of control in what they're doing so that they are satisfied and yet still maintain enough control from the bishops and the conferences so that these local congregations don't go crazy on them. And they've tried to come up with different ways to do that. Presently, what they do is they allow local congregations to have the deed on their physical property, but they hold that deed in trust for the denomination. there's a lot of things in Methodism. It's kind of like kissing your cousin. Do we own it? Or do we not own it? Well, yeah, you do, but you don't. But that has been their way to try to satisfy local congregations, give them some sense. The other thing is that the bishops and the conferences decide where the preachers go. That's even true around here. It drives me crazy. I try to make friendships with the pastors around here, certainly the Baptist pastors. We've had a good group of them. But also with Methodists and others. And this is just us talking tonight, right, church? We'll keep this off Facebook too, right? I don't really think that you're supposed to have women pastors.
Amen.
I really don't. And some night we'll talk about that, and I'll go through the numbers, go through it with you by the numbers and tell you why. I'm not going to do that tonight. And so it makes it hard for me. I try to be nice and have friendships and relationships with those that are Christian churches who believe in that. They have women pastors here in town. And we try to work together as best we can, but it's hard for me. I just, be honest with you, it's hard for me because I don't believe in that. But they're Christians. I want to be civil with them. And this is one thing that Methodists have done. And around here, it's frustrating for me because I want to build relationships with fellow pastors. And those darn Methodists, you know what they do? They come into town, you take them out to coffee, you get to know them, and the next thing you know, they're gone. They're gone. And that all goes back to John Wesley. In that whole control thing of moving the pastors around and being in charge of what's going on. Now, they have a reason spiritually. If we had a Methodist here tonight, they would say, now, Richard, you need to be fair, so I'll be fair. Here's the reason that they would give for moving pastors around rather than allowing a congregation to keep a pastor. I'm going to just ask you out of curiosity, can you think of any deleterious effect there is to leaving a pastor in one congregation for too long? Okay. If it's a very charismatic figure, then the church will grow up around that person. And when that person does finally leave, what happens? The church collapses a lot of times. So that is a danger. Anytime a church is built on a personality other than Jesus Christ, there's a problem. That's the only personality we're supposed to build a church on. Okay, what else? Can you think of another reason that it would be bad to leave pastors in one place rather than forcing them to move around?
Be authoritarian.
They could become authoritarian. They've been there too long. They think they own the place. Okay.
The opposite of that is they could get a bit too lax.
How is that, Kim?
Soft in old age.
Sometimes they get burnt out and need to move on. Okay?
Well, and sometimes the pastor and the congregation just don't mesh.
Sometimes it's not a good match.
It's just not a good match. And
Yeah.
it's, if he doesn't do anything morally wrong, the church don't want to fire him, but it's just not a good match.
Okay? She's optimistic. I like her. If he doesn't do anything morally wrong, then the church won't get rid of him. So a church would never get rid of a pastor for anything other than... Okay. I just wanted to clarify that. Now, actually, you're hitting on some of the things that the Methodists would say in defense of their system. If you leave a pastor in a place too long, he can become burnt out. Or they would say he or she, obviously, could become burnt out. They could actually get, this is might be a little uncomfortable, they could actually get a little too close to the people in the congregation. Ooh. Now, why is that bad?
It's hard for the next guy coming in.
It's hard to rebuke, maybe, a congregation if they need to be. Oh, yeah, I see the way you're looking at me. If the pastor's got too close to the congregation, that congregation needs to be corrected. Will the pastor have the fortitude to correct a group that maybe he has become too enmeshed with emotionally? What? Not sure that the Methodists would discipline their congregation anyway, so that may be a moot point.
I think it has something to do with their pay scale too, doesn't it?
It might, Jenny, but I don't think they would use that as a defense for it. Yeah, Gene?
Well, I disagree with that. I think Jenny's right on. Oftentimes, as a pastor goes up in age and whatever.
They make more money?
They make more money, and they will direct them to churches.
Okay. I didn't think about it that
That
way.
has a budget.
Right.
How they will could support that, maybe give it away.
Hmm. So that might be an argument for not having the bishops in control of moving the pastors around. So that's the case for moving the pastors around. We are Congregationalists, and you control who your pastor is, not a bishop or a conference or a denomination. What is our argument for saying our way is better?
God places him there.
What's that, Lisa?
God places him where he's supposed to be.
Okay. Well, they would say the same thing. They would say that the bishop is led by God, and that maybe he's more led by God than you are because you're just a person in the pew.
Oh, no.
I was raised in it.
Okay.
I've never heard that.
I don't think they'd say it out loud, Gene. I think that's one that the bishops would talk around the water cooler. The people, kind of that Gruber, some of you know what I'm talking about, that Gruber attitude, that the people don't know what's best for them. We need a professional group who can make the right decisions for them.
Like you said, the denomination had a way of breaking up. That gives the top kind of control to prevent that sort of thing.
That's true. So
You have one person that's in control, you don't have a congregation that's going to make decisions and break things up.
Kevin said that, right or wrong, I'm not sure if he's coming down for or against, but he's pointing out that when you have a group on the top that's in control, then they can usually keep the organization together better.
I'm not in favor of that.
Okay. He's not in favor of that. Okay. And that's true. You can control the group more and keep them together more, but they're together against their what? Against their will. And these, as crazy Americans, we find ways to split up anyway. Once Methodists hit the shores here, they found ways to split off. And even in England, if we continued to follow Methodism in England, which we're not going to, we would find that they wanted more local freedom too. Let's write something down real quick. Number 5, American Methodists divided over a variety of issues, including local control. Local control. Who should be in charge of the church? Who should decide what property is purchased, sold, when you move, when you build a new building, when you expand the parking lot? Who should decide when to hire another preacher, when to expand the staff, when to fire somebody? Who should make those decisions? Rodney? I think all groups would agree with that, and that's a great answer, God. The Methodists would agree with that. They would say, yes, God should make that choice. Baptists, we would say, yes, God should make that choice. Now, the next question is, how do we know what God's choice is? All right, we pray, and who decides? If a group of 150 people get together and pray, what's going to happen? They'll get the answer. And who decides what that answer is? What kind of church did you grow up in, Rodney? Rodney has been indoctrinated by what's called congregational polity. He can see it no other way. I love you, brother. Yeah, for those of you, though, who have grown up in Methodist churches, and now you're in a Baptist church, or maybe in a Presbyterian church, or even have come from something like Catholicism, you have experienced something different. And it may have been strange for you to become a Baptist and realize the autonomy that each congregation has. Having grown up in it like Rodney did, I'm the same way. It's just a part of the way I think. I've never known it any other way. Judy?
Each congregation knows its own personality of the people. It knows its own needs.
She's a Baptist too.
But that doesn't, but that's not necessarily how decisions are even always made. I kind of see both sides of it. I think there's good and bad in both sides.
Okay. Is there a biblical text that we can go to that will help us with this quandary?
They selected the 12th disciple after Judas hanged
When they selected the 12 disciples, what,
himself.
Claire?
12th disciple after Judas hanged himself.
Okay, that's a good, they had to choose another leader to take Judas's place, and they did it through prayer. But that wasn't necessarily a local church looking for its leadership. That was the beginning of the movement, and they were going to begin to build churches. All those 12 men were going to lead the movement at that point.
When they elected the deacons then.
Can you think of an example in the New Testament where they elected leaders that we could look at that might give us some direction?
Acts chapter 6.
Exactly right, John. Acts chapter 6. What happens in Acts chapter 6?
Churches formed.
Deacons. Most of us would say that's where the original deacons came from. And there was an administrative problem with the distribution of food to the widows. There was a problem between the Hellenistic Jews and the Hebraic Jews. The Hellenistic Jews thought that they were being given a short end of the stick. And so they brought it to Peter and the other apostles. And what did Peter say? This is very instructive here, what he did. He said, we need leaders to take care of this so that we can keep our emphasis on prayer and the ministry of the word. So you do what? They've got the whole, and the language is emphatic. They got the whole group together, it says. The whole group of disciples at that point. And he said, you pick men that you believe are full of the Holy Spirit, full of wisdom, etc., and you bring them to us, and we will appoint them. Now, what just happened? What would the Methodists say just happened?
Peter appointed. Peter made it.
The Methodists would say, there you are. You got a bishop. He makes the appointment. We're good to go. The Baptists would say, no, wait a minute. What would the Baptists say?
We elected him.
Oh, those leaders were chosen by whom?
Us.
The people. The people chose those leaders. And then they brought them up. Well, we're kissing our cousin again. Because it doesn't solve the issue. I hate to tell you this, Rodney. And for those of us who have grown up in what's called congregational politics, where the congregation makes all of these decisions. But let's stop and think about this for a minute. Isn't it true even in our own church, when we're ready to choose a deacon, for instance, when we're ready to choose a deacon, what happens? What's the first step? First step is for the leadership of the church to recognize there's a need. And that's what happened in Acts chapter 6. The leadership of the church said, we got a problem here, we need a new leader, or some new leaders. And in our church, in most Baptist churches, that's usually the first step. The active deacons and the pastors say, we need some new leaders. And then they come to the church and they say, what? You pick some men that you believe are qualified, and you bring those names to us. And then we will do what? We will appoint them.
That's within the church.
But that's within the church.
So is Peter a pastor or a bishop?
That's a good question. So, see, Kevin just blew the whole thing. See, I was doing so good there. And he said, but what we do is within the church. Was Acts 6 just the church, one local church? Or was it the church global, so to speak, where Peter is kind of like a bishop? Was Peter acting like a pastor in a local church, or was he acting like a bishop in a movement? If he's acting like a bishop in a movement, then we've got Methodism and Presbyterianism and so forth and different versions. If he's acting like a pastor in a local church, then we've got congregational polity, we have the Baptists. Why doesn't the Bible answer that question for us? frustrating. Kevin says it's not terribly important, although it makes a big difference. We have to know what we're doing if we're going to do it.
Paul was the original one.
Paul was the original itinerant preacher. In a sense, he was, because he went back to those but we would call Paul, Methodists might call Paul an itinerant preacher, but Baptists would call him a what?
A missionary.
A missionary, yeah, a foreign missionary. Because he was going into new cultures and planting churches, and that's what missionaries do, we think. Here's what a lot of people have concluded, and I'm with them on this. This is the end of the issue, okay? Unless you think of something better, you can come tell me. The New Testament is a picture of the church as it's developing. It's called the early church, big E, big C. And it went on to develop after that. And by the time that the New Testament document was finished, there was still some developing to go in polity, church polity. But there was enough in the New Testament at that point for most Christian groups today to point back and say, there's the reason why we do what we do, the way that we do it. And we've already seen by studying Methodists that they changed when they came from England to the United States because they were in a different environment. When they were in England, they were in an environment where there was a king who was put into power by divine right, and Christianity in some ways reflected that. Is there something in Christianity that reflects a king who has a divine right? Absolutely. There may be, stay with me now, there may be a dynamic to a Christian's experience in England that we don't have that is actually good. What would that be? It would be this. If we lived in England, we would grow up with a inbred respect for whom? The king. The king. And if you ever had an audience with the king, you know what would happen? Why, you would be trained on how to act in the presence of the king. And you would do that once you had the opportunity. And you would never forget all of your life that you, on one particular day, had the opportunity to enter into the inner sanctum and to be in the presence of the king. Now, church, there's some good stuff there for understanding who God is. Now, us crazy, individualistic, pioneer-spirited Americans, we really don't know what it means to have a king. We know some other things that they don't know. We know what it means to have liberty. We know what it means for the church to be separate from the establishment. We know some things that they need to know, and they know some things that maybe we could learn from.